Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Creator in Conversation, the official podcast of TASQ Art, TASQ Art, Tala Academy Sequential Art, Ireland's first academy dedicated entirely towards comic book design and production, essentially sequential art storytelling. What's sequential art? Images in deliberate sequence juxtaposed to convey a narrative. Also very important for visual communication of information. Sequential art can open up a variety of different fields outside of comic books as well: games, animation, film and television. In this series, Creator in Conversation, we've invited a number of leading industry experts within the comic book field and some adjacent fields as well, to convey their insights into their influences, process, observations they make from their years of experience. Today's episode is rather special as it wasn't intended originally to be an episode of Creator in Conversation. What you're about to hear will be an interview with Steve Ellis, who is a brilliant artist. He's worked for so many leading companies. He shares some of his Marvel memories with us in today's episode. And I had invited him to be a guest speaker to the students at TASQ Art. So apologies in advance. My microphone isn't the usual one I use for interviews. It's a little bit different, so the sound quality may vary, but don't worry, everything will be a-okay. But Steve was very good to come along and speak with the students at TASQ Art, and even after this conversation you're about to hear, stayed back and did portfolio reviews, reviewing some of their work and giving them some tips. Steve provides brilliant insight and really talks about how to make a page flow, composition and what to consider in your portfolio. This is a totally enjoyable conversation. I think you're going to enjoy it as well. So sit back and relax with today's episode with Steve Ellis and Creator in Conversation. Wonderful. Thanks so much, Steve, for joining us here today. You're back to being a student yourself now at the minute, working on your master's, you were saying to me. How are you finding that?
It's exciting. It's a lot of, I'm trying to figure out a whole new method of working. So it's kind of it's pretty cool.
It's exciting though, isn't it? Just
very
about back,
exciting. Yeah. It's like, looking into learning, whole new process of pipeline of work and kind of figuring out different methods of doing things. And since it's a master's, I'm doing a lot of experimenting and writing too. So that's kind of part of it. So, which is actually kind of exciting because it's, after having done freelance for so long, having the opportunity to really dig deep into what I do and think about it from a kind of critical standpoint and kind of look at it from a different standpoint is actually really helpful, because I think I'll go back to whatever I do next with that new information and the ability to really look at it. You don't always get that much time to think about what you're doing when you're working as a freelancer and just, job after job after job after job. It's hard to get the planning done in the same way.
Honestly, it's something I've been saying. I think I even said it to the students this year. Like, this could be the only time in your career where you actually take time out and just think about this stuff, because the rest of the time is either looking for work or you're knee deep in the project. But to just think out about like process, it's such a gift that we give ourselves just to take time out and actually reflect on how to do this, why it's done this way, can it be done a different way. So as you were saying, experimenting is like, that's a good place of learning, is one that lets you not only reflect but experiment. Coming into your career, so you were saying like you did a lot of freelance stuff. What was your pathway entry point into comics then professionally? How did you find your quote unquote break in?
So my break, there were actually multiples over time, but the first one was a while ago. So what first happened was I started working for Marvel Comics back in 1993. And the way that happened was I had just been I had graduated from art school and made a bunch of samples and just kind of mailed them out to all the companies except Marvel, because I didn't think Marvel would ever accept me. Without really realizing that Marvel was probably the one company that was hiring more than anyone else at the time. And so eventually a friend of mine convinced me, just send it to Marvel. I was like, all right. So I sent in some samples, and then I got back from this one editor named Carl Potts. I got a book that was like uh, a photocopy of one of the Andrew Loomis books with like perspective and all this other stuff. He was like, "Yeah, read this, kid," And then literally the next day, I got a call from one of the other editors at Marvel, and he's like, "Can you come in and meet with us?" And I was like, "Of course." So I wasn't living near New York at the time, so and back then the industry was much more physically oriented because there weren't that many conventions, and it was mostly kind of New York centric. They had a few people that lived elsewhere, but because there was no, the internet wasn't really. Are you still there?
Yeah, yeah, still here. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Somehow my screen just switched. I don't know what happened
Oh,
there.
is it gone black on you?
It
Like it's
just
just blank out?
No, it switched. You just I all everyone just slid to the side. Oh, there we are. I don't know
No
what happened.
worries.
Anyway, so the so back then the industry was very kind of like, you know, in New York City. So I lived about an hour outside, so I was able to go in and meet with them, and then I got a small job on Iron Man then, and then basically what I learned from there was just keep going and bugging everyone as much as I could, go into the office as much as possible and talk to everyone. But that really only applied at that time, right? Because over the years, what started to happen was the companies got more international. The internet became more of a thing where people were posting their work up, and so the offices became, they locked all the doors and started doing more conventions where they would have editors go to and stuff like that. But sorry, my kid is filling up a glass of water in there.
No worries.
But so what ended up happening was the over the years, like there was never any straight like, oh, I'm working for this company for good kind of a thing, right? So I'd work for a month and then have to look for another job, or I'd work for 2 or 3 months and then have to look for another job. So it was kind of a what do you call it? A lot of like, like you were saying, like you know, work on a project and try and juggle the finding another job at the same time kind of thing back and forth.
And just to bring it back just a bit, Steve, you said when you sent out samples to the studios, what type of samples, like what did that consist of? Were you doing
Oh,
pinups or sequentials? Was it
oh, had to be
pencils and
sequential
inks?
art. Yeah,
Yeah,
no,
definitely
no. I mean,
sequential.
and it's funny because back then it wasn't even a question because there was, the only pinups they had at the time were covers, right?
Mhm.
And they need someone who can tell a story. And if you're not telling a story, they don't even look at it. Because they can walk around any convention and see a million people who can draw Spider-Man flipping off a building, right? That's
Mhm.
you know, uh, to a certain degree, that is the easiest of the skills you need. Just be able to draw the characters. And plus, like on top of it, a lot of people who just draw the characters can just look at someone else they like and make it look like that. So the editors are savvy enough to kind of know, like, all right, if you can't show me storytelling pages, then you don't know what you're doing, right? So they all had to be, all the samples were pages of short 3 to 5 page stories. And I was featuring Marvel characters at that point.
Mhm.
But I did samples of some DC characters. I did samples of Marvel characters. At the time, I was kind of making up my own scripts because I didn't have a writer connector connection. But nowadays, you can find places where you can download scripts that like writers have put up there for people to use. So if
Yeah.
you're there are some professional scripts out there, like Mark Waid, I think, has done a few of them, and a few other writers where they'll put their scripts out to make it, to do your samples. But if you're not doing continuity, uh, then you're not even going to be considered. Um, Maybe to do covers, but you have to be, the covers. It's interesting, like over the years, it's changed. Like when I first got in, the same artist who did the cover was the artist who did the interior. And they took pride in that, right? That the cover was always done by the interior artist. Over the years, nowadays, like you pick up a comic and the covers, by one artist and the interior is by a whole other team, sometimes I feel like that kind of is false advertising to a degree.
Hmm.
But I don't know how many times you've picked up a comic and gone, oh wow, that's beautiful, and then you open it and you're like, oh, and then you put it back, right?
It
I
seems to
think,
be getting more like we were saying the other day, the card collector mentality, where
yeah.
that they know what they're doing, they're leaning into that kind of business model.
But yeah,
So I
they've
do,
been. I mean, that's kind of changed. Like, it kind of shifted to that in the '90s when I first got in, um, and that had been the thing. Like, yeah, just make the cover really glitzy and shiny and put sparkles on it or whatever, and then people will buy it for the cover and make it a new number one, and then and that'll solve the problems of low sales on issue 4 or whatever. Um, but that's why Marvel almost went out of business in the '90s. So if they're doing that again, it's a good sign that they're running out of ideas and they're about to go out of business or something. Um, I'm not kidding. Like, I've seen, so just in the years that I've been in the industry, I've watched the comic book industry go up and down and up and down and up and down and up and down, and and companies go up and down and out of business, and reform under new people only to go out of business again. And frequently, the what you'll find is that the once the companies get desperate, they start to put out, we're going to put out 6 covers of the same issue with 6 different artists doing the cover, and then hopefully someone will buy that. But what that means is they're not confident in the material they're putting inside. And if you don't deliver on the interior, what happens is you get a first issue, people buy it because it's a number one. Maybe they read it, the percentage of them that read it. And then that percentage, if they are not, if they're just buying it because it's a number one, then they're not buying issue 2 no matter what. If they're buying it because if they buy it and then read it and enjoy it, then they might buy issue 2. So what tends to happen with comics every single time is the issue 2 numbers are like half of what the first issue numbers are. And
yeah,
if you have one that actually has really caught attention, it tends to go down the second issue, down the third issue, and then goes back up on the fourth issue. So you only know if you have a hit or a success until you get to issue 4. So it's a lot of material to put out before you know whether or not the book you have is actually getting traction. And so a lot of publishers, like you'll see, like they do 4-issue miniseries, which isn't enough to find out if you've got a successful book, but it's enough for a trade. So what they've done is they've said, okay, we're going to put out 4 issues. At the very least, we get a trade, right? But they don't build on the idea that that 4th issue, if they're going up, maybe that 5th issue will go up. But since they're not planning on that, what tends to happen is all the joy and energy that goes into that book finally coming back out of that slump from issue 2 and 3 gets cut off right at issue 4 because they plan for it to end with issue 4 because they just want to put a trade out. And then if they're planning it that way, it's generally months until the next book. And then there's enough time in there for people to lose interest.
Mm-hmm.
So the successful books tend to see through that 4th issue and then get into the 5th, 6th, and on. And then, probably once they're like 7th or 8th, if they're really starting to, get traction, then they're a book that'll last. But it takes that long, and that's like 8 months of, well, it's more than 8 months, but it's 8 months of being published, but it's, a year ahead of that, more than a year ahead of that, making the books and putting them out. It's funny because I'm saying this and I just did a 4-issue series. So what do I know?
Well, it's with the Marvel situation, it's curious because I think a lot of that stems from, and this is just outside of speculation, being a Disney company now, that Disney want to be number one, so they'll do that and print what they have to. See a lot of team up books and crossovers.
Yeah. No, they've been doing that forever.
yeah, it's forever.
Yeah,
That's it.
The team ups and the crossovers. I mean, like that started. So if you were to read Marvel comics back in the 80s, it's actually very different in a way. I mean, it's actually not that much different from how the movies ended up, but that's only by coincidence. The Spider-Man never crossed over with the Avengers.
Mm-hmm.
The X-Men never met the Avengers. And then they did this big crossover called Secret Wars back
Yeah.
in like 1985 or six. I forget. I was a little kid back then. And Secret Wars, basically, they brought all the characters from the entire Marvel universe together. And up until that point, you might have like Thor be in a Captain America comic, but it was very rare.
Mm-hmm.
And they had built long continuity of the characters. So each character had like years of not seeing another character, except maybe on the side. Like, Captain America would have a phone call with Tony Stark, right? That would be about it. Um, and then they started doing more of those crossovers. And then after Secret Wars, they saw, oh, wow, we can make a lot of money if we put all the characters together. And so then over the years between Secret Wars and I forget the other one at DC, which was
Crisis.
Crisis, right? Between those two events, they realized, hey, this is an opportunity to get all the fans of Spider-Man to buy every book in the entire line, right?
Yeah.
So suddenly they realize we can actually make money at this business if we have them buy all the books. And the way we do that is by making them all have every year you have this big continuity mash where all the characters get together. And now every fan has to buy all the books if they want to keep up with it. So what would happen is you'd read like, issue 565 of Spider-Man, then you'd have to read Thor number, 78, and then Iron Man, 865, and then go back to Spider-Man, right? And so they started doing that more and more. And so now it's like a yearly event that they do that. And sometimes I think it's multiple years. Like now I think they do it more than once a year. But it really started kind of ramping up in the 90s when they were really losing a lot of their monthly buyers for the people who are just buying them for big, like shiny covers or big events. So the crossovers became a selling point, right? So that's what's going on with them now, probably still. They've been building off that same model for years, and unfortunately, I think it shows that their quality of their long-standing stories don't last. So whereas they used to have continuity for characters that would go for 10 years,
Mm-hmm.
where the character would actually get that long a story, or 5 years, maybe not 10 years, but you could get a story that was that long and follow through. Now it's like broken up in the middle. 6 months in, you have to do a crossover with every character in the Marvel universe, and then maybe you can get back to your own continuity again. And that happens on a yearly basis. So
just to pivot, sorry,
Steve,
to pivot back a bit, just to
sure.
the portfolio side of
Oh, sure.
things.
Yeah. Let's get
Yeah,
back
yeah,
to
yeah,
that.
yeah. No, sorry, because everything there with the industry insight
Oh, yeah.
is fantastic. But I know the guys will lynch me now because I do
Yeah.
nothing but speak that to them.
Sure. No,
And
that's totally cool.
it's
Yeah.
just that you're a much superior artist to discuss the technique with portfolio. Because when you went with you were saying you did some samples, but before you did that, you said you were an art graduate. So what from
Yeah.
your formal education as an art student led over to your skill set as a comic book artist, sequential artist? I assume anatomy, still life,
Yeah.
anything like that would have
Well,
worked.
when I went to art school, I went for an illustration
Hmm.
degree. And I had a lot of life drawing.
Hmm.
Um, and the illustration degree didn't really cross over with comics as much as I'd hoped. So there were a lot of skills I kind of had to build on my own. But life drawing, I'm trying to think, learning how to paint, things like that. But
And what were the
learning
skills that you?
composition was a
Oh,
big
sorry.
one. Composition and design are really important, especially in comics, because it's like you can draw really well. That's great, but if you can't compose a panel and you can't, tell a story from panel to panel, that's the trick. If so knowing where to put flat color or flat black against a figure, or knowing how to balance your like sometimes you'll see panels in a comic book that are very realistic with a realistic background, right? And then you'll see panels in a comic book with just a head and a color shape, or a black shape or something behind them, or you'll see a graphic design element, and those are all done for different storytelling needs for the panels. And so knowing how to design, compose for storytelling, compose different kinds of images, drawing backgrounds, drawing buildings. In comics, unlike a lot of other businesses, you have to draw everything. The one artist, if you're the penciler, you have to know how to do, if there's a phone in the background of a scene, you need to have to be able to draw that phone and make clear that it's a phone. If it's a tree, you make sure the tree looks like a tree, and that phone looks like a phone, and that telephone pole looks like a telephone pole. They can't look like the tree and the telephone pole can't look alike, right? Because it's all about visual communication. So when an editor is looking at your portfolio, what they're looking for is, can you take what's important in the script, discern what the important parts of the description in the panel are, because sometimes the writers don't always know, and figure out just how to put in order, kind of create a hierarchy of what's important in the panel or what's important on the page, and then pace it out from panel to panel. And so what that means is, like, if you have a character like, Bob is walking down the street, right? Well, you kind of have to think about the way I look at that, at least, is think about each panel as a sentence, and how you would break down a sentence where you have the object and the subject and the predicate, and you're looking for the who, what, where, when, and how in the panel, right? So if it's, Peter Parker is walking down the street, he's sad, and he's holding his web shooter, right? So all of those things are elements you need to have in the panel, and you need to determine what's the most important thing. Is the most important thing that he's walking down the street, or is the most important thing that he's looking at his web shooter? Because if it's that he's looking at his web shooter,
is there anything that the writer can emphasize in the script? Like, as a way to emphasize it?
The writer can, and it really depends. So, like, there are a couple different ways that they do scripts. Although the Marvel style of script has gone out of fashion. The old Marvel style of script that I started working with, which was basically like being thrown in with the wolves, is I worked with Roy Thomas. He was the first writer I ever worked with, which is kind of huge because he was, big name. At the same time, the script I got was a single page of text with 3 paragraphs describing the whole story. And I had to basically figure out the pacing of every page, of every scene. I had to figure out where the events were happening, where the characters were located, how they were interacting, how the different things were going on, because it was very general. It was literally like, oh, on this page, let's have, actually, I shouldn't even say it on this page, because he wasn't even saying that. He would say, the beginning of the book, Spider-Man is upset about Aunt May because Aunt May is sick. And meanwhile, Mary Jane calls him on the phone, and, he needs to talk to her about, like, the date that he's going to go on. And then he sees Doc Ock on the street, and, Doc Ock is kidnapping an old lady from a building, and he thinks about Aunt May again, and he runs down an alley and gets his suit, right? And you have to then determine how many pages that's going to be, what's going to happen on each page. How do you have a satisfying cliffhanger on the end of every page that then leads into the next page? And then each scene has to have a satisfying cliffhanger to lead into the next scene. So there's a lot of work left on the artist's shoulders in the Marvel style, but that was developed basically when Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko were drawing for Stan Lee. And Stan Lee was basically doing as little as he could to write because he was trying to write all the Marvel books. So the artists were basically carrying the heavy weight of writing all the Marvel books. But then DC had a different style, and they've kind of developed more of a movie style script where it's like, there's a description, there's dialogue. Oh, by the way, they didn't write the dialogue for the characters until after you did the artwork in the Marvel style. So you would do all the art and then hand it in, and you would put the notes in for what you thought the characters should say in every panel. And then the writer would, add their flourishes. So it was a very art forward kind of system. And, sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't work. But I think some of the best comics came out of that too, because they're visually striking. The DC style, which is kind of I think it's become more of the everybody doing it now style, because it allows the editor and the writer to have more control over the book. Because, if you think about it, when you had an editor before looking at a plot script, the artist had a lot of leeway to do whatever the heck they wanted, right? So you get the book back and be like, oh, now what do we do? We have to put this thing together. So having a full script gives the editor a lot of opportunity to be more in control of things. So what that means is that the writer now has to be more clear and specific about, okay, panel 1, this is what's happening. This is the dialogue. Panel 2, this is what's happening. This is the dialogue. But that also means that the writer needs to really understand how art works, what can happen in a panel. So what I've seen with some writers, and if you have a good editor, this doesn't happen, or a good writer, this doesn't happen, but it still happens anyway, it gets through, where the writer will say, this character is, throwing the baseball and giving this other person the finger and running down the street at the same time, right? So they're doing 3 different actions at once, and that can't happen in one panel, right? Every single panel kind of has to be 1 action per panel. You might get away with 2, but for the most part, the way the language of comics works best is to give you one piece of the story at a time, right? So the writer really needs to know how to kind of parse down their ideas into smaller pieces so that it can be drawn in a panel form. And you can have more than one idea in a panel, but you really have to be clear that the ideas are that there's a hierarchy between which idea comes before which in importance and which one's going to continue from panel to panel to panel. And so there are times when if the writer, there have been times when I've gotten scripts that have come to me in 5-page increments, which is a problem because if there's an object that appears on page 3 and I don't know it's important because the writer didn't tell me it's important, I just do a thing, right? It's there. Okay. There's not, the telephone isn't, or there's a gun on the table in the background. I don't know it's important. So there's a gun there. Sure. Fine. I draw a little gun, but I don't make any deal about it, right? So it's just this little squiggle in the background of the scene. Well, later on, when that gun is what's being used to kill somebody and it has to be there for the scene, the reader goes, where the hell did that gun come from? Because then they have to go back and look, oh, there's that little teeny tiny gun in the background. Now, if the writer said, angle on, the character puts the gun on the table, and there's a panel of the character putting the gun on the table, or even better, the hand putting the gun on the table, so we see the gun in a nice big, image, that's one idea, and it tells that one idea. And you can have dialogue going over it, right? That's like, look, Muggsy, or whatever, whatever silly dialogue you might have. But parsing that out into single ideas where, many panels need to be, the gun is put on the table. He gets in the car. He drives down the street. He crashes his car into the side of the building. But they all have to be separate ideas. They can't be, it can't be, he gets in the car, drives down the street, and crashes into the building, which I've actually seen panels like that, or scripts like that. It's like, you can't, I could do that in one panel, but it's going to be a very confusing and very bland panel. Because it's going to have to be done on the side, where everything, because that's 3 things that you need to be incredibly explicit about, right? Getting in the car, driving the car, crashing the car, right? Those are three separate things. If the character's just crashing the car and they don't show the first two, then how did the guy get in the car? Where'd that car come from, right? So now, okay, you have to establish the car. Then you have to establish the character going up to and getting in the car. Then you have to establish the character maybe not turning on the car, because we can assume that, but we have to see them driving down the street, right? And then we have to see maybe ahead of where the car is going, oh no, there's a building in front. And then you have the car hitting the building. So you need to break up the ideas into these very distinct, separate steps. So for the writer to know how that's done, I mean, you could shorten it. It could be, but like more than likely, that could be as much as a 4-panel spread of ideas, or at least 2 or 3, right? So the writer really has to pick and choose the images that they're making and think about what's reasonable to do on a page. And a page really needs to be a single idea. Because what you want to do is you want to say, in a page, the character goes from from point A to point B, and point B at the end of that page is like, now I want to turn the page because this is interesting. Right? So every time you start a page, you want to, you may not need to establish where you are because you may have established it in the last page, but you need to establish what the situation is, what's going to happen on this page, and then how we're going to make it interesting so that you flip the page.
Would you say, because you yourself also a writer as well as an artist, would you say being an artist has given you an advantage of being a comic book writer as well? Mainly because if you're hired in a writer's role, you'd be, they'll know you're also an artist, but also you have the visualization skills, like the visual skills down. So you're already used to that breaking down. So you kind of can anticipate that in the script. And also, when you write for your own stuff, do you write a full script? Or do you just do an outline when it's just yourself?
Okay, so the first one, yeah, I think having, at least as a writer, having some working knowledge of visuals and how they work is very important. You need to really, I mean, like I would sit down, and if I was going to write comics and not be an artist in comics, I'd probably sit down and read that old Will Eisner book and Scott McCloud, and just absorb as much as I could out of that. And maybe even how to draw comics the Marvel way. Just so that you know it's like a screenwriter writing for the actor. You know what you're telling the actor what to do, and you're using the same language, right? You're like, when you say, or if you're writing in a screenplay and you say, pull back to see this, well, you need to know the phrase pull back, right? Or whatever you need to know the language that you're speaking with the other artists, with the artists. So that's important. And then I think the second part of your question was, when
you write a script for yourself, do you do an outline or do a full script?
So it's actually kind of funny the way when I've scripted things out myself, what I do is I ping pong back and forth. So what'll happen is I'll have an idea for the story, and I'll do essentially I'll write an outline. And then once I've written the outline, what I'll start to do is I'll lay out the book. And the first thing I'll do is I'll take if it's a 24-page book, I'll make 24 little tiny thumbnails of just each page. And then I look at the story and I say, okay, so scene number 1 requires this much time, for instance, right? Okay, so scene number 1 is going to be the first 3 pages of the book. Scene number 2 is going to be the next 5. Then scene number 3. And what you try to do is I'll sit there and I'll try to find that story arc, where right before the end of the story, there's something really exciting that can happen. Even in the 24 pages, you want something really fun to happen. So if it's 24 pages, you want something fun to happen, like something really exciting around page. If it's 24, maybe around page 20, maybe around page 19, something like that. If it's a 20-page book, maybe around 16, somewhere towards the end, but not necessarily at the end, unless you want to really leave it on a big cliffhanger. But you want to give some story that has a resolution, even if you leave things off. So for the next for the next issue, right? So you want there to be a point in the story where something at least has been resolved before you leave them with the cliffhanger, right? So that's when that final couple pages is. So if you can work backward, you say, okay, so the last page is where I establish my cliffhanger for the next issue. So now I'm down to 23 pages. And then you go, okay, so if I know that, now I can look at how much do I need for the kind of the final victory, or the final you know whether it's they get one up on Doc Ock, but then Dr. Doom crashes through the wall, and that's page, whatever it is, like however you do it, or they finally get Mary Jane to agree to marry them, and then Doc Ock crashes through the wall, right? But so whatever your journey for the character is, that's going to happen towards the end of the book, right? That's how we, you generally, and then you kind of have to figure out, all right, once you've figured out the number of pages for each of those, you can kind of figure out from there, this is going to take 3 pages. Oh, that's all I have left for this scene. So that gets 2 pages, right? And then, sometimes when you're looking at it, you kind of tweak it as you go. So once you have that bare structure, then, and that's just like thinking about an average of 6 panels a page, and so how many things can happen on a page, how many events can happen on a page. And then you kind of break it down from there. You go, okay, well, now that I know this is how many events can happen on a page, this is how many events I have for the story, this is how I'm going to end, this is what the big crescendo is, and this is my opening image and my opening scene, right? Now you can start to, and this is where I say I ping pong, start to lay out some pages and then write. So what I'll do is I'll start to go, okay, on page 1, I want to have a big splash page. So that's going to be really exciting and big. What image do I want to use? Do I want to use the image that is the first scene of the book? Or do I want to use an image that's later on in the book, and I'm going to go flash forward to something that's happening later on? How am I going to work that into the story, right? And then you kind of work through that by, you jump to that, that big splash, which hopefully draws people in. I've seen some really boring splash pages, which is really shocking to me. But that's supposed to be the page that people open to and go, holy crap, I want to read this book. So if it's just like, seen splash pages where it's like the interior of this giant boring spaceship with these 3 little figures standing in the bottom corner, that's not a good splash page, right? It's a terrible, terrible splash page. Because you want to draw the people in with something exciting. Like, this is entertainment, right? So you really want to, that first splash page needs to really knock their socks off, right? You want to really get them to go into the book. And that's why that last page is important too, because the first page wants you to make you read the book. That last page wants you to go pick up the next one, right? So each page, like the first and the last page, are really important. One brings you in and one makes you go buy the next issue, right? And that's in the traditional issue structure, right? So, but anyway, what happens is once you have those breakdowns of three pages for this scene, then I go through and I break it down by ideas. What's going to happen on each page? So I know there's 3 pages for this scene. Okay, then the first page needs to be this, and we end up with this. This page ends with this cliffhanger that makes me turn the page. And a cliffhanger can be someone turning their head and going, what? It doesn't have to be a big thing, but it's just enough to make you go, who's standing behind them, or whatever it is, right? Or, Peter Parker's talking to Aunt May, and then so you hear the words, excuse me, from off panel, and Peter's like, what? And then the next page starts with the doctor coming in saying, well, Aunt May's got, 3rd-degree burns all over herself from Doc Ock. And then, and then the end of that page is Peter going, oh no, is she ever going to wake up? And, and you hear, beep, beep, and then you flip the page and she wakes up, but so what you're doing is you're kind of pacing it to create anticipation for each next page, right? And you do that for each scene. So once you know that you're going to have each of these little kind of endings for each scene, then you go, well, how many panels do I need to get from Peter just goes to the hospital to who's that standing behind Peter? Well, that means you need to have him. Peter goes to the hospital. We see the establishing shot of the hospital. Peter walking down the hall with his hands in his pockets, looking like, I don't know what I'm going to do about Aunt May, right? Because you always have to have him whining about something. And then, and then he sees the nurse, and the nurse says something because she thinks he's cute. And he goes, I don't know. She was looking at me funny because, I'm talking old Peter Parker, not the current Peter Parker who's like in his 30s and married. But, I'm talking classic Peter Parker. Why was she looking at me like that? Oh no. And then he's like, and then he comes in and he sees Aunt May. He's like, she looks so hurt. What's wrong with her? And then who's that behind me? Right. And now, okay, that's 6 panels, or that's 5 panels, or that's 4 panels. Right. And so now you can break it down to, well, what image do we need for the first? Okay. Establishing shot of the hospital. Number 2, establishing shot of the interior with Peter walking down the hall of the hospital. Number 3, Peter talks to the nurse. Number 4 is a close-up of the nurse saying something, because she thinks he's cute, right? And the next panel is him close-up of him looking like, oh gosh, what's going on? She's being weird to me. And then the next panel is he walks into the room with Aunt May and looks concerned. And then, wait, there's someone behind me, right? So that's what, 6 panels? Right? Now you know what goes into each one of those panels, and then you can write the dialogue to that. Right? Mm-hmm. So for me, it's kind of like I might have an idea of the dialogue. Like if it's Reed Richards and he's talking about some sort of quantum drill that's going to allow him to open up gateways to other universes, and I know that dialogue is specifically important, right? Yeah. I might need to write that first, right? But if it's just like something that's much more normal and universal, like someone going into a hospital, it might be better to lay out the story first visually and then work the dialogue. So for me as an artist, I kind of go back and forth. But like guys like, let's see, Alan Moore does a lot of layouts. And I know a couple other writers who do layouts. This guy, David Gallagher, I worked with for a while, used to do layouts, but he'd never show anybody. He wouldn't even show me, but it was just for himself to be able to break the pages down so that he knew that what he was asking for was possible, right? Yeah. Because you need to be able to know that what you're asking for works as a writer. I hope I didn't talk too long. Does that make sense?
No, this is brilliant. And okay. It's all gold, Steve, all gold. What I want to do is I just want to ask one last question for myself. Okay. Then I'm going to throw out to the class then. So guys, if you have questions, just raise the hand and we call upon you then. Then I'm going to end the recording because I know at least Yaya has stuff they want to share. So I won't put stuff if anyone wants to share anything on the recording. But the last one I'd say before we throw out to the class is there any do's or don'ts when it comes towards portfolio reviews, or just portfolio prep, I should say? Like, what's the biggest pitfalls you would say you come across when someone presents the portfolio to you, or you might have done in your early days when presenting your portfolio? Is there anything in particular you could advise? Don't do that. Or the opposite, okay. Is there something you definitely should do? Like lead with something, lead with this.
Well, so one thing is know what you're going in to look for, like work-wise. If the traditional comic book thing nowadays, it has changed nowadays, but it used to be very specific that if you're a penciler, just show pencils. If you're an inker, get someone else's pencils to do inks over. If you're a colorist, get someone else's pencil and inks to do colors over. If you're a writer, you're gonna have a little bit more trouble because getting someone to sit and read a script is tough. So with a lot of writers, what I've seen them do is they'll work with another artist and get the artist to do the pencils for them, and then the artist has some samples to show, and then the writer has something to show, so they can each show their chops. But like one of the biggest mistakes I've seen is someone saying, "Oh, I want to be a penciler," and they're showing me finished colored art. And so what ends up happening with that is I can't tell whether you're good at penciling because it's covered over by these other things. And unless you're really good, and the real thing is that a lot of people don't realize that the main thing that's the penciler's job more than anything else is the storytelling. yes, it's good that you draw well. You need to draw well, but that is less important than being a person who knows how to stage, uh, how to place the figures in space, how to do the perspective, how to do acting, how to move the characters from place to place, how to draw all the different things. The inker's job traditionally is what they used to kind of go between two different names for a while. There was the inker and the embellisher. I haven't seen embellisher in years. And more they're getting rid of the inker because digital has kind of made it easier for an artist to do it themselves. But that can frequently confuse things because what I've seen is sometimes you're really good at telling a story, but you haven't figured out how to finish your drawings yet. And so if you want to get experience, it's going to be harder for you to get experience if you ink them like garbage, because that's going to be what they see, right? Similarly to if you want to be an inker or a colorist, if you're drawing and inking it, they only know what you do on yourself. So an inker, what tends to be the best thing for inkers and colorists is to get multiple samples from other pencilers or penciler and inker teams, if you're a colorist, so that you can show what your work looks like on different types of artwork. So if you're an inker and you're like, I want to go work. I mean, again, like I said, I know inking is not as big a thing anymore, but let's say you want to apply as an inker to Marvel or something, you might choose 3 different pencilers to get pencils from so that they can see how versatile you are and what you're bringing to the finished work. Because every inker is going to have their own personality. And what they're going to want to see is what your personality over these pencils is. And there are some, there's like kind of an insult about inkers calling them tracers, right? A good inker is not a tracer, but there are tracers out there. But a good inker is someone who embellishes. They make the lines prettier. They render things that need to be rendered, and sometimes they make a decision to not render things because the penciler over-rendered stuff. And that happens because the penciler is really focusing on making that story make sense, right? So the penciler is like, I'm getting the right angle, I'm getting the right look, I'm going to put the lighting over here, I'm going to do this over there. And the inker looks at it like, well, if I ink that, it's going to look super over-rendered, right? There's going to be too many lines everywhere. So I'm going to cut out half of this lines, but I'm going to make it pretty. And that's their job, right? And then similarly with the colorist is to kind of look at the art and say, what serves the story with the colors, right? So similarly to the inker and to the, in every case, right? If the point of the panel is, oh, I'm getting off track. I'm sorry. Should I stop or should I continue with this?
No, that's
Okay.
that's
If the
brilliant.
point of the panel is Spider-Man is going to go grab a soccer ball, right? And it's on the street, that soccer ball better be visible. Because if the colorist sits there and says, oh, well, the soccer ball isn't that important, I'm going to paint it dark green against a dark blue background so we can really look at Spider-Man, well, then the point of the panel is totally gone because the whole point of the panel was the soccer ball, right? He's going after maybe there's a bomb in the soccer ball or whatever, right? Whatever it is, but that's the point of the panel. So the colorist and the inker. So the inker has to know what's going on in the story to be able to say, I'm not going to over render that soccer ball because I want the high contrast on that soccer ball to really allow it to pop. And then the colorist has to go, oh yeah, let's make it white against black or very pale color against a very dark color. So it really pops off the surface because everything about this panel is about him reaching for that soccer ball. And if that's not the point of the panel and I screw up the coloring or the inking, you can totally change the meaning of a panel, right? So it's so much about language. So in every case, each one of those people, so if you're going to go as a penciler, show pencils, try to get different scripts to work from with different characters so that they can see variety. if you're going to be an inker, try to find multiple pencilers. If you are going to be a colorist, try to find, multiple teams that you can work over. And if you're a writer, try to work with different artists so that they can see how your writing comes through. Which is, again, it's hard with writers because, then you have to get letter and all that other stuff. So then you have to, there's a whole other consideration. So a lot of times writers will hand in scripts. I just don't know how successful that is without something drawn.
Yeah, a lot of what I hear is they tend to send a finished story, but
Yeah.
some editors and reviewers are usually pretty good that they won't judge the quality of the illustration, but more about, as you pointed out, the beats per panel and how it flows. So they wait and
Yeah.
see because they'll put that then on the writer if they're
Yeah.
communicating.
But it is hard because if the point of your panel is, Spider-Man, the only dialogue you need in the panel is "oh no," because he's reaching for the soccer ball, right? And the colorist or the penciler or the inker doesn't accentuate the soccer ball, that panel doesn't make any sense. So you as the writer kind of have to be your own editor in that case and kind of make sure that the people who you're working with are getting the proper point across in the panel, because when you have an editor, that's on them to do that. But if you're handing in a sample, you got to make sure that whoever you're working with is communicating with you well so that the point of the panel is clear.
Yeah. That's brilliant.
So now if you're nowadays, I mean, sorry to interrupt you, but like nowadays there are people who are penciler inkers, right? Or like I've done pencil ink and color for my own project, right? Then you really have to bring it, and you better be confident that all three work, right? Because the weakest link is going to be the one they see. They're gonna say, "Oh, you may be a great penciler and inker, but I can't sell this with those shitty colors." Pardon my French. You know what I mean? But like, you may be the best colorist in the world, but your pencils are terrible. I can't put this on the stand. So you have to make sure that I didn't, I would do, when I was working on my projects, and I've done a lot of personal projects over the years. The first one I did was black and white because I didn't know how to color at the time. I didn't have a computer to color with at the time. So, and coloring back then was way more expensive than it is now. So I couldn't do color, so it was black and white, right? And I was pretty confident in my penciling and inking, right? Then for the next book, I hired a couple of colorists to work on that project. To mixed success, because some of them were new colorists because I was newbie and I was hiring my friends and they weren't necessarily fully skilled. And then the next project I work on years later, that was my own, I did all the pencils, inks, and colors. And I did that for 2 major projects. And then most recently, which was really weird, was going back to just being the penciler. And it was an ego learning process because I had to accept the fact that someone else was going to ink and color my work. That was really hard at that point because I'd gotten so used to being the guy who does the whole thing, and being successful at that, and also, like, if you're doing the whole thing, you can create a better pipeline or you can create a simpler pipeline for yourself. Because one of the things about each one of those steps in the process of making the artwork is you're always trying to be super clear with the person who's coming next. So the writer has to be really clear for the penciler, right? The penciler needs to be really clear, like, these lines are important, those lines are not. This is where we want to focus. This is all that, so that the inker inks the right lines, right? So your penciling has to be super, like what they call tight. And what that means is, that doesn't necessarily mean that every line has to be perfect. It just means that where the lines are important, they're perfect, right? And and they got more and more tight over the years that I started working there. Like when I first started, I was a little loose with my pencils, but then they started asking for more and more and more complete tightness. So now you see guys like, I mean, now I'm probably aging myself, but you'll see people like Brian Hitch, right, whose work is, he's noodling the background figures that are like smaller than an eighth of a, or like a millimeter in the background. And they're like, he's putting their hats and suits on them, in his pencils. So, there's that became much more, that's more of a recent phenomenon, or Frank Whiteley, right, with all the super deep detail. But that was usually kind of a mix between the penciler and the inker would kind of do that. Now it's the penciler does it all, and then the inker has to redo it all because the penciler wants to make sure that nothing gets lost, and then the inker wants to make sure that everything's there. It was a little simpler when you were working in the same city as each other because you could talk and you could say, you literally sit in the same room and go, can you put more detail on that? Like, or whatever, or what's happening here? Whereas like now, I've had the experience of having people in, different countries that I'm working with different languages. And that can be difficult, especially also when the editor steps in between and doesn't let you communicate with each other or doesn't want you to communicate without them there, because that can be both wonderful and terrible, because if the editor doesn't know what you're thinking, he can't send that on to the inker, right? So he or she, I should say. So the communication is really important, and a lot of the communication has to be done in the artwork. I mean, you can talk about it, but if you send it and they don't decide to ask you a question about it, they're just going to ink how they see it. And if that was an important thing that you just kind of did there and they didn't consider it important, then it's not going to be an important aspect. So that soccer ball is going to be, misrendered, right? So there's a lot of little. So what's started to happen more and more is the penciler basically draws it like it's a finished piece of artwork, and then the inker inks it like it's a finished piece of artwork, which has made why inkers have become less and less important, because since the pencilers are doing so much work to kind of make up for that communication loss, it's like, well, why don't you just scan in the pencils, right? So that became, the next step. It reduced the kind of the number of jobs. But I think a really good inker is a really special person who does some really beautiful things that a penciler won't necessarily do, and that the tool of ink has its own language that pencil doesn't. And if you're trying to make pencil look like ink, it always looks bad. It always looks like it's like you're mixing your mediums instead of using the right medium for the job.
Okay. Oh, excellent. And thanks a million for that, Steve. Like,
Sure.
It's very insightful, and it's great to hear from someone who's actively like working on it as well, because it brings a whole. When we look at it, it can be theoretical, or it could be just examine our own work, but someone active in the field, it makes all the difference. I just want to, as I was saying, just to throw out to the class before we do any like shared work, if anyone has any questions they want to come in with Steve. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, Steve, thank you so much for your time. I just want to quickly ask the question. I think you mentioned earlier on about composition and like the storytelling, and I agree that's probably like the most important part of paneling and doing comic work in general. Do you have any tips on where or how you would improve composition, especially for someone who doesn't like have any formal art education?
Well, okay. So the first thing you want to think about in every panel is what's the most important part of the panel? Or more accurately, what's the most important part of the image? Meaning, like, where do you want the viewer to pay close attention to, right? So going back to that kind of thing with Spider-Man, right? If the soccer ball is the bomb, right? And Spider-Man is going to try to grab the soccer ball. Well, think about your composition, like as in, I would say, what's the key number one important thing? And then what's number two? And think about it as like supporting ideas, right? So number one is the ball. Number two is Spider-Man reaching for the ball. right? So now you have a natural through line between the ball and Spider-Man's arm. So now in a way, think about it like an arrow, right? So Spider-Man is an arrow pointing towards the ball. So when you're building the composition, if you always think about, like, for comics also, we read left to right. So you're going to mostly have your compositions moving left to right. Did I do that right? I'm trying to do it in reverse, right? Yeah, left to right. So if you think about, Spider-Man coming this way and the ball being here in a panel, right? He's reaching out to grab it. That would be a great composition of him reaching in like this. And then think about what other elements you can have in your image that can point you towards the focus image. So like, let's say in the background, there's a fire escape, right? Because he's jumping off this fire escape to go after the ball. Well, maybe you work your perspective so that the fire escape, the long lines that make up the fire escape, point towards the ball, right? Now you have Spider-Man pointing towards the ball, and you have the fire escape pointing towards the ball. And if you play your cards right, you can have the perspective of the whole building pointing towards the ball, right? And so suddenly now you're building kind of a reinforcing structure, right? Of everything is pointing you towards the one thing that's most important. And if you set it up like that, so like here's your panel and you set it up for them going to this corner here, right? The next step, if you have them going up that way, well, then the viewer is going to want to go like this, right? If you have them going this way, well, they're staying in the page. So their natural instinct as a reader is to go to the next lower tier and read across. If the panel goes up like that, then they're going to start going up and off, right? So it's very subtle. What you want to do is from that top panel is lean them down from the upper right, we read left to right, upper left down to the lower right, and follow that through each tier. So if you've got 3 tiers of panels, they all want to go down like this. I would use the idea of a typewriter, but that's like even an old concept for me. But the way people read is they go ding, ding, back to the first line, right? So if you imagine that as they're going, that you take them across from, even if it's like 4 panels, like 1, 2, 3, 4, and they go down, they go to the next layer, next level, 1, 2, 3, down to the next level. So you want to think about like a zigzag that kind of takes you down to the lower right-hand corner, and then down to the lower right-hand corner, and then finally down to the lower right-hand corner into the next page. So if you think about that and you think about your composition simply, don't try to put too many things in, and think that every single element that you have in the piece, nothing in the artwork is what it is. It's all a compositional element. What I mean by that is if you have trees in the panel, those trees should point you towards looking at the main character. If you have buildings in the panel, you should point towards the main action. Every single element that you have, if it's there, its purpose should be to move the reader from the widest view to what you want them to actually look at most. And if something in your composition is throwing them off in another direction, get rid of it if you can, or rethink about where it is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's really helpful, especially when it comes to detail, because I always struggle with like figuring out like the economics of detail and trying to make it more efficient. But I really like that like mindset. Thank you very much.
If you go, I mean, like this guy's kind of an old he's an older guy, but if you ever look at Jack Kirby's stuff, he'll have these really, really super crazy, elaborate spaceships. But if you look at the composition of the spaceship, it's like it's like gridded in lines with all these like designs and all over it. But if you follow it, they're literally like this one's big, this one's small, this one's smaller, and it takes you right to the hero, you know? And he's using those crazy designs. And even though they're super heavily patterned and there's a lot of detail, all of the details are arranged in such a way that he's either grouped the detail into an area so it acts as a pattern. And you know, if you think about it that way, like group your detail into kind of larger shapes that can lead you to an object, then you can kind of manipulate. You can have your detail and, you know, and get all that texture that you want without distracting from the main focus of the piece.
Okay.
Right.
Understood.
So, you know, think bolder lines first, the bold movements, and then the detail comes after. The detail is like decoration on your bold movements. So if you really get the bold movements down, the detail is just texture, really.
Understood. Okay. Thank you. That makes sense. Thank you so much.
Thanks a billion, Steve. And Amanda had a question as well. Just try.
Okay.
No, it's pretty much covered there. Thanks.
Okay. All right.
That's brilliant. Then in that case, what I'll do is I'm going to close out the recording now. And then actually, Yaya actually has some work she wants to share. So I'm just going to close out the recording before we share. Before I do that, Steve, if folks want to find out more, I see your stuff, like what do you have coming out? Where can they follow you online? Or do you have any platforms you prefer to?
Yeah. Well, so I'm basically Steve Ellis Art on, let's see, Blue Sky, Instagram, Facebook, and anything else is Steve Ellis Art as one word. And that's also my website is steveellisart.com. I've tried to make it all one, so it's really easy to get to, which is a good tip. Is don't have, like, a lot of people have like crazy Instagram titles for their pages. And it's like, how am I going to find you if your website is, you know, your name and your Instagram is like Funky Monkey and your, you know, your Blue Sky is something else? Like, you know, part of it is you want it to be as easy as, again, it's like the same thing. You want to be as easy as possible for people to find you. Even if it's boring, it's better that it's boring and clear. Or if you're going to be Funky Monkey, you're Funky Monkey everywhere. You know what I mean? Like you have to, and that's your brand now. You know, that's your identity to the world. So, and you'll see people do that. Like you'll notice, like a lot of the biggest artists at like Marvel or DC or whatever, if they have a fake name, it's that fake name anywhere, everywhere. Or if they have their name, it's always, you know, the real, or, you know, their name and art or whatever, just so that like it's clear who they are and what they're doing.
Brilliant. Okay, super. Thanks so much, Steve. I'm just going to end the recording here now, and then I'll send it out to everyone. And then, whenever you're ready, if you want to share a screen, just go ahead. Thanks again, Steve. My thanks again to Steve for taking time out to address the students of TASQ Art, and I hope you, the listeners, enjoyed this conversation as well. Steve was very generous in not only taking time out to speak with the students, take their questions, review their portfolio work, but he also gave me permission to share this in the Creator in Conversation podcast as well. So I really hope that some of you listening in may find great benefit, insight, or may even give you something to ponder, to incorporate into your projects that you're currently working on. So thank you again, everyone, for listening. If this is your first time listening to the Creator in Conversation podcast, please consider subscribing to our YouTube channel. You can find it under @TASQ Art, TASQ Art. If you would like to participate in some of these episodes, or learn more, or perhaps find support in your craft, do consider becoming an Academy member. And to find out more about that, visit tasqart.com, TASQART.com. Until next time, this has been a copyright production of Macaulay Consultancy 2025.